Peter, pumpkin eater, had a wife and he couldn't keep her. He put her in a pumpkin shell, and there he kept her very well. This nursery rhyme also has its roots in America, unlike most of them that started in England. It was a different time back then for women, and for views on divorce, which is why this rhyme served to warn young girls about infidelity. Peter's wife was supposedly a harlot, and Peter's remedy for the situation was to kill her and hide her body in a giant pumpkin shell. The Shadow is a bleak Hans Christian Andersen tale about a good-hearted writer who loses his shadow. Years later it turns up on his doorstep, having seen the world and decided being good-hearted is for sissies. In the months that follow, the two live together, the writer being good and becoming poorer and unhealthier, and the shadow being a real jerk and becoming richer and fatter. Finally, the shadow offers the writer a trip to a health resort, all expenses paid, so long as the writer agrees to switch places and become his own shadow. At the resort, they meet a princess. The shadow woos her and hatches a plot to take the writer's place permanently. Wow, you may be thinking, how would the writer get out of this one? By being executed. When he realizes the shadow's plan, the writer tries to stop him, only to be arrested while the shadow marries the princess. He disappears, and, as an afterthought, we're later told that he was executed. The good man dies, and the evil doppelganger gets to marry royalty and continue living large and being a jerk. Goosey, goosey, gander, whither dost thou wander? Upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers. I took him by the leg and threw him down the stairs. While Mother Goose seems like a kind, grandmotherly sort, the gander in this rhyme appears to be a real jerk. This 16th century rhyme has been used for decades as a reminder to children to always say their prayers. Lucy Lockett lost her pocket, and Kitty Fisher found it. Not a penny was there in it, only a ribbon around it. Both Lucy and Kitty were real people, back in the 18th century. Lucy Lockett was a barmaid and a sometime prostitute. When one of her wealthy lovers lost all of his money, she dropped him like a hot potato, only to learn afterwards that her rival, Kitty Fisher, had taken up with him despite his poverty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. In children's books, Humpty Dumpty is portrayed as a large egg, usually dressed like a little boy. It's a sad story, as he gets busted up and nobody can fix him. However, the real story behind the rhyme dates back to the English Civil War. Humpty was a huge cannon mounted atop a high wall-like church tower. During the siege of Colchester, the tower was hit by enemy cannon fire and Humpty suffered a great fall. There was no fixing the cannon or the tower, and the Humpty Dumpty rhyme was then born. Georgie, porgy, pudding, and pie kissed all the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. Georgie Porgy could have been one of two men, either George Villiers or Prince Regent George, 18th century. The first was an upstart who wormed or earned his way into the court of King James I. George Villiers was likely a bisexual who had an intense and fairly well-documented attachment to the king. King James was extremely fond of George and gave him money and titles. Now, while there is no sure definitive proof of a homosexual relationship between the two, King James's affection was without doubt. Either way, George still loved the ladies as well, and was rumored to be fond of seducing noblemen's wives, sometimes without the consent of the ladies in question. This fact, together with well-known and probably very necessary ability to avoid confrontation, makes him a very good fit for this particular nursery rhyme. As much as George Villiers may seem like the perfect candidate, many people believe that it was actually Prince Regent George. He was enormously fat and notoriously gluttonous. He couldn't fit regular clothes, but he certainly fits the rhyme. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but he definitely loved the ladies. The last couplet might refer to an incident where George attended a bare-knuckle boxing match, which left one contestant dead. He ran away and hid himself, afraid of a potential scandal. So Georgie Porgy is really a coward, a cad, and a glutton. Not exactly the best moral for your children, perhaps. Oranges and lemons. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clemens. You owe me 5 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. When will that be, say the bells of Stepney. I don't know, says the great bell of Bow. Here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head. Chip chop, the last one is dead. The second part of this nursery rhyme is a clue to the purpose of the first part. The poor fellow ends up dead. The bells belong to famous churches in London, so it's possible that these were the churches a condemned man would pass on his way to his execution. St. Clement's, the first church, is likely that in Eastcheap. The Eastcheap docks saw the unloading of cargo from the Mediterranean, often including oranges and lemons, but not only fruit was unloaded at Eastcheap. It was also the dock at which condemned men would disembark to begin their final journey. The Jew among thorns. Now in this old Nazi favorite, a servant is given a magic fiddle that can make anyone dance, so she uses it to force a passing Jew into dancing among thorns until his skin is literally flayed off of him. As justification for mutilating a complete stranger, the servant simply says, Jews have fleeced people often enough, and now the thorns shall do the same to you. And in this tale from 1001 Nights, called How Abu Hassan Break Wind, Abu Hassan gets drunk and accidentally lets one rip in a monumental way. Mortified, he runs away, only to be pursued across the world by his humiliation. A decade later, he emerges from hiding and makes his way back home to find his earth-shaking fart has gone down in history, and he's now a national laughingstock. Because that's the sort of message you want to send your kids. Mess up now, and people will laugh at you forever. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. This rhyme dates back to the Great Plague of London in 1665. The symptoms of bubonic plague included a rosy red ring-shaped rash, which inspired the first line. It was believed that the disease was carried by bad smells, so people frequently carried pockets full of fresh herbs or posies. The ashes, ashes line is believed to refer to the cremation of the bodies of those who died from the plague. The Storks is actually an old fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, and it's all about arbitrary infanticide. The Storks starts out as a worthy successor to his ugly duckling. A bunch of baby storks are learning to fly, while the neighborhood children mock and jeer them. So what happens? Well, the storks stick it out. They learn to fly and rise, both literally and figuratively, above the bullion, right? Not exactly. It turns out that these are the same storks that bring babies. So when they've learned to fly, and it comes time to deliver some squealing infants, they make note of the kids who bullied them the worst, and they make sure and deliver them dead babies. Bear in mind, they do it specifically to take revenge, and the story clearly states that the kid that they're determined to traumatize in this case is only 6 years old. And then there's the story of Bluebeard. You know the story. A girl marries a guy with an all-over blue rinse who tells her she can go anywhere in the house except for the locked room. Because telling someone they can't do a specific thing is usually the easiest way to ensure they're going to actually do it. So of course in the story she unlocks the door and finds the remains of his previous wives. Bluebeard then tries to add her to his Leatherface collection and only fails when her brothers arrive just in the nick of time. So what's sinister about Bluebeard is that the message is identical to the mantra of abusive husbands everywhere. Do as you're told and you won't get hurt. At one point in the story where the girl shows initiative, she nearly pays for it with her life. Molly Whuppie is an old Scottish folktale that teaches you to repay your hosts with mass murder. Abandoned by their parents, Molly and her sisters seek refuge in a house. The woman who lives there agrees to feed them as long as they eat up and get out before the giant she's married to returns. So because it takes more than a flesh-eating monster to actually scare Molly away, she mucks around and is actually still there when the hungry giant comes a-knocking. So guess what Molly does while the wife begs her husband to spare their guests? She robs the place and tricks the giant into murdering his children, and then finally into murdering his own wife. That's the same wife who was just pleading for Molly's life, you see. So the moral of this story, always repay kindness with genocide. Hans Christian Andersen is at it again with his tale Big Claus and Little Claus. In this tale of warring farmers, Hans Christian Andersen really outdid himself. Amidst all the carnage, one scene is conjured that almost makes the extortion, murder, and suicide of the rest of the story pale in comparison thanks to its disturbing overtones of necrophilia. So for reasons too complicated to explain, Big Claus wants to murder Little Claus. To this end, he waits until midnight, climbs through the window, and buries an axe in the human form resting in the bed. Looks like he succeeded, right? Well, until we discover that Little Claus isn't in the bed, because that's where he keeps his dead grandmother. Now honestly, the amount of explanation we get is so sparse we can only conclude the worst. So when Andersen mentions Little Claus sleeping in a chair beside the body, quote, as he had done many times before, the insinuation that Little Claus is the Norman Bates of fairy tales becomes pretty much overt. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells, and pretty maids all in a row. This rhyme is a reference to Bloody Mary. The garden refers to growing cemeteries as she filled them with Protestants. Silver bells and cockle shells were instruments of torture, and the maiden was a device used to behead people. So the version of Red Riding Hood we all know involves a big bad wolf eating a pensioner, eating her granddaughter, and then finally getting cut open by a woodsman. Now the older versions actually skip out the quote, cut open by a woodsman part, ending the tale with Red Riding Hood dead. But even older versions end with Red Riding Hood eating her grandmother, then doing a striptease. Early folk tales were often very sexual, and Red Riding Hood can be traced back to the 10th century. In some versions, she takes off her clothes and is actually eaten by the wolf, a metaphor, of course, for being raped. And in others, he starts some, shall we say, do-it-yourself, and she escapes. And yet others involve defecation. So what they all have in common is their utterly horrible moral. If someone murders your grandmother and tricks you into eating her remains, take off all your clothes. So the original edition of Grimm's fairy tales carried two different versions of this story. This story is called How the Children Played Butcher. Both start with some children watching a pig being slaughtered and deciding to play at being butcher. Both then involve a scene where a child slits another child's throat as part of the game. One version subsequently takes the death wish route by having the mother of the slaughtered child murder his killer, accidentally kill another child, and then commit suicide. All the while, the other has the killer child arrested. Both versions are super violent, and both versions were banned in Germany. So it's true occupying forces were so sure of the tale's contribution to atrocities that they made it illegal, along with nearly all of Grimm's works. In his respected study on German nationalism, Louis Snyder argued that the tale's morals were often nationalistic, authoritarian, and violently racist. The Nazis themselves used them as propaganda. Ba Ba Black Sheep from 1731. Though most scholars agree that Ba Ba Black Sheep is about the Great Custom. It was a tax on wool that was introduced in 1275. Its use of the color black and the word master led some to wonder whether or not there was a racial message at its center. Its political correctness was called into question yet again in the latter part of the 20th century, with some schools actually banning it from being repeated in classrooms, and others simply switching out the word black for something deemed less offensive. The new alternative is Ba Ba Rainbow Sheep. London Bridge is falling down. Would you ever associate child sacrifice with London Bridge is falling down? Probably not. But it's an idea associated with London Bridge is falling down that's been debated for decades. Now, there's no archaeological evidence to support it, but the theory goes that in order to keep London Bridge upright, its builders believed that it must be built on a foundation of human sacrifice, and that those same humans, mostly children, would help to watch over the bridge and maintain its sturdiness. Three Blind Mice comes to us from 1805, and of course it's yet another ode to Bloody Mary's reign, with the trio in question believed to be a group of Protestant bishops, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Bradley, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who all unsuccessfully conspired to overthrow the Queen and were burned at the stake for their heresy. There's also the story of the boy who went forth and learned what fear was. A young boy isn't scared of anything, so he goes out on a quest to try to find something that scares him. On the way, he breaks a priest's leg, sets a bunch of corpses on fire, stays in a haunted castle, stabs a bunch of cats to death, goes bowling with human skulls, and he beats an old man with an iron rod until he gives him all of his treasure. And then there's the story called Death's Messengers. Death throws down with a giant and gets his butt kicked. A young man helps Death up, and Death promises in return that while he must eventually take the young man, he will give the man fair warning before he does. So the young man becomes old, and then one day, from out of nowhere, Death shows up at the front door. The old man is mad, of course, because he didn't get any warning, but Death says, well, of course you did. You got old. And right there in front of him, the man dies. And who can forget the story, how the children played slaughter with one another. A couple of young boys see their father butchering a pig, and naturally they think, hey, we should do that. And the older boy cuts his brother's throat. Naturally, Mom is kind of pissed about this, and stabs the surviving son right in the heart. And then she remembers that she left the baby in the tub. Well, the baby drowns, and she hangs herself out of grief. About that time, Dad comes home from work to find his entire family dead, and he dies of grief. Then there's the story called The King of the Golden Mountain. And in this story, a young man travels across the ocean, gets beat up, finds a princess, marries her, becomes the King of Gold Mountain, then he gets ditched by the princess, finds a magic sword that'll cut off everybody's head except for his own, and then he begins to cut off everybody's head except for his own. And then he lives happily ever after. In the story, the mouse, the bird, and the sausage, a mouse, a bird, and a sausage live happily together in the woods. The bird fetches wood from the forest, the mouse gets water from the well, and sausage does all the cooking. That is, until all the other birds make fun of Bird for presumably being a wood-fetching wuss. Bird's feelings are hurt, and he demands that they switch up jobs. Sausage goes to fetch the wood, but gets eaten by a dog in the forest. Bird tries to fetch the water, but drowns in the well, and Mouse burns himself alive trying to cook.